Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest aliens and UFOs video. Alright, let's go ahead and let's start with chapter 1 here of the book UFO Sightings by Alan Baker. And then that way I'll go ahead and I'll feature several parts to this chapter and then in turn start featuring the other chapters of this book as well. There was a very positive feedback with my introduction video. Lots of good comments, good views as well. So people are definitely interested in having me continue with this playlist, and so I'll be doing this throughout who knows maybe how many weeks and so on. This one, as I mentioned in the other video as well, has to do with chapter 1, specifically a close encounter of the so-and-so kind, meaning several chapters will deal with the 4 different kinds of such close encounters, and in this case I'll be doing Chapter 1, Part 1, because Chapter 1 itself is a little bit long, so I'll separate it out into other parts too. But great stuff when it comes to this brand new introduction, because this is Chapter 1. It's called Close Encounters of the First Kind, which it itself chronicles as observers report a close-at-hand experience without tangible physical effects. Fascinating stuff, right? I'm already getting some eerie goose marks when it comes to this stuff. So let's go ahead and let's feature chapter 1 here, part 1, and then I'll give my own thoughts and opinions on it afterward. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are too. So here's how it starts. Mystery flyers and ghost rockets. Contrary to popular belief, the history of UFOs in the 20th century does not begin with Kenneth Arnold's sighting in 1947, nor did the early UFOs correspond to the familiar disc-shaped objects that have been so frequently reported in the years since the Second World War. In fact, in terms of sheer strangeness, the phenomenon started very much as it meant to go on with the arrival in the early 1930s of the so-called mystery flyers. Far from appearing as sophisticated spacecraft, the mystery flyers were frequently described as large, multi-engine aircraft which circled towns, railways, and even ships out at sea. The main theater of this activity was northern Scandinavia, although some sightings were made in Britain and the United States. According to the American researcher John Keel, these machines, while resembling conventional aircraft in terms of configuration and propulsion, were far larger than should have been expected for the time. A group of 5 witnesses reported seeing an enormous plane with no fewer than 8 propellers. In addition to this, the pilots of these machines often exhibited a cavalier attitude to the dangers of aviation in the inhospitable regions of Norway, Sweden, and Finland. Not only were the mystery flyers reported during raging blizzards, which would have quickly forced any conventional aircraft to the ground, they also had a habit of cutting their engines and circling in silence through the driving snow. The Swedish government became alarmed at these outlandish claims and in 1934 dispatched 24 Air Force biplanes to search the remote areas where the ghost flyers had been seen. The search failed utterly to resolve the puzzle. In fact, 2 of the Air Force planes succumbed to the harsh conditions and crashed. Fortunately, their pilots survived, which cannot be said the same for the hapless George Engelhard Wanberg. A lieutenant in the artillery regiment based in Gotland, Norway, Wanberg set out on skis on a journey from Tanas to Storlien, on a path that would have taken him directly to the region where the ghost flyers had most often been reported. He was never seen alive again. Extensive searches by the Norwegian Air Force failed to find him, and on January 4th, 1934, a group of 3 men joined in the search, heading out into the vast and increasingly sinister northern wastes. When they failed to return on schedule, new search parties were dispatched to find them. On January 12th, the 3 men arrived at the New Style station. The reason for their absence was never divulged. 5 days later, Lieutenant Wanberg's frozen body was discovered a few miles from his tent. Apparently, he had left the tent without equipment or skis despite a raging blizzard and had walked into the mountains to meet his fate. No explanation was ever given for this suicidal act of an experienced outdoorsman. As with more modern UFOs, the mystery planes seem interested in areas of strategic or military importance and often directed powerful searchlights at the ground. On January 23, 1934, a large gray spacecraft circled the Norwegian freighter Tortkelland near Tromsø, Norway, and directed an immensely powerful searchlight beam on the ship's dock. According to Captain Sigvard Olsen, the pilot of the plane was visible in the illuminated cockpit and wore a hood and large goggles. As more and more reports came in from the inhabitants of the rugged Scandinavian hinterlands, the military authorities became yet more alarmed. These ghost flyers were performing maneuvers that would have proved fatal for any conventional aircraft. Does this sound familiar? Such as circling at less than 100 feet in violent storms with their engines switched off. On April 30th, 1934, Major General Rudersword, based in Upper Norrland, Sweden, issued this press release. Comparison of these reports shows that there can be no doubt about illegal air traffic over our secret military areas. There are many reports from reliable people which describe close observations of the enigmatic flyers, and in every case the same remark has been noted. No insignias or identifying marks were visible on the machine. The question is, who are they and why have they been invading our air territory? One of the factors that so perplexed the Scandinavian military was the apparent lack of logistical support for the flyers. The number of reports that were being received suggested that a very large number of aircraft were involved, perhaps hundreds. Large aircraft operating in the harsh conditions of the Arctic regions would have required considerable backup in the form of bases, mechanics, fuel, spare parts, and numerous other supplies, none of which have been revealed by the extensive search expeditions that have been mounted. As John Keel states, no other country could seriously be suspected of these bizarre infringements on Scandinavian air territory, certainly not Germany, which had yet to build the Luftwaffe, and certainly not the Soviet Union, which had neither the equipment nor the desire to mount such a dangerous and apparently useless reconnaissance. In spite of the intensity of the military investigations of these sightings, the ultimate origin of the ghost flyers was never discovered. However, Scandinavia was eventually to play host to an equally perplexing mystery. Following the Second World War, the ghost flyers were replaced in the cold skies over Scandinavia by the ghost rockets, which exhibited even more extraordinary aerobatics. These cylindrical wingless objects were reported to leave fiery trails in their wake as they shot across the sky at fantastic speeds, diving, climbing, and occasionally even landing. Once again, the Scandinavian military authorities were extremely concerned about these unauthorized overflights of their territories and enlisted the aid of a U.S. Army Air Force intelligence expert. Lieutenant General James Doolittle and an expert in aerial warfare, General David Sarnoff, and British researcher Timothy Good states that a press blackout was quickly established, for which there were two reasons. The first was that since the ghost rockets were assumed to be missiles, a standard procedure was followed whereby nothing of the rocket sightings would be revealed, thus denying their builders any information regarding the accuracy of their targeting. The second reason was that the origin of the rockets was still unknown, and the authorities, perhaps understandably given that the war had just ended, were anxious to avoid public panic. In July 1946, a special committee was set up to investigate these sightings, chaired by Colonel Bengt Jacobson, head of the Material Department of the Air Administration. The committee also included representatives from the Defense Staff, the Research Institute of National Defense, the Defense Radio Institute, and the Naval Administration. Although about 80% of the sightings were found to be explainable as mundane objects and celestial phenomenon, the remaining 20% resisted such identification, prompting the speculation that the Soviets were secretly testing V-2 missile technology with the aid of captured German scientists. However, the Swedish government announced in the results of its official inquiry into the sightings that the objects were not the V-shaped bombs used by the Germans in the closing days of the war. Although some witnesses stated that they had seen ghost rockets crashing, no wreckage was ever discovered. Some fragments, allegedly having fallen from some of the objects, were turned in for analysis, but were found to be nothing more unusual than lumps of coke. This did nothing to alleviate the sense of concern that continued to be felt by the U.S. State Department, which, according to Timothy Good, had upgraded its communications with the embassy in Stockholm to top secret. The fact is that, as with earlier mystery flyer sightings, no ultimate explanation regarding the ghost rockets was ever forthcoming. The idea of a Soviet origin, while briefly mooted, was discarded since the ghost rocket's performance far surpassed that of the V-2 missiles. Although vast improvements in ballistic technology were not far away, they had certainly not been achieved within the year at the end of the Second World War. As the ghost rocket sightings gradually decreased in frequency in the months that followed, all official investigations into their origin were halted, and a worldwide curtain of secrecy was lowered over the entire subject of unexplained aerial object. Now the saucers arrive. Although the unfortunate term flying saucer gained popular currency as a result of Kenneth Arnold's description of the 9 objects he saw over Mount Rainier in Washington state, he was not referring to the shape of the objects themselves, but rather to their mode of flight. They flew, he said, with an undulating motion, like a saucer would if you skipped it across water. The objects, he reported, were in fact crescent-shaped, more like flying wings than flying saucers. The encounter occurred on the afternoon of June 24th, 1947, when Arnold, a 32-year-old successful businessman from Boise, Idaho, was flying his private plane at 9,200 feet over the Cascade Mountains, aiding in the search for a missing Marine Corps transport aircraft. A sudden flash caught his attention, and he looked into the distance to see a chain of 9 peculiar-looking aircraft flying from north to south at approximately 9,500 feet elevation and going seemingly in a definite direction of about 170 degrees, in other words, towards the distant peak of Mount Rainier. Arnold estimated the wingspan of each object to be about 100 feet. Having never seen aircraft of this type before, he attempted to gain some idea of their velocity by timing their passage from the peak of Mount Rainier to the peak of Mount Adams. As the first object passed the first mountain, he noted that the cockpit clock read about 2:59 p.m. By the time the last object passed Mount Adams, Arnold saw that 102 seconds had passed. He later established the distance between the two peaks was 47 miles, which gave a ground speed for the objects of 1,700 miles per hour. The most advanced aircraft of the time had yet to achieve half that speed. Using various landmarks as reference points, he estimated the 9 objects to be 20 to 25 miles away, forming a chain approximately 5 miles long. After the sighting, Arnold flew on to Yakima, where he told some friends what he had seen before continuing the final leg of his journey to Pendleton, just over the state border with Oregon. When he arrived, he found several skeptical reporters waiting for him. However, when his respectable background became evident, their skepticism largely vanished to be replaced by intense curiosity, a curiosity that has been shared by people all over the world for the last 50 years. In the view of that fact, it is rather ironic that the Arnold sighting was probably not of genuine UFOs. A number of possible explanations were put forward after the encounter over Mount Rainier. These included a mirage of distorted mountain peaks caused by temperature inversions, in which light rays are bent in their passage through layers of air of different temperatures, resulting in the apparent projection of mundane objects into locations where they shouldn't be. Alternatively, according to the U.S. Air Material Command, Arnold might have seen a collection of large flat hailstones which had formed under the icy conditions of high altitude, or perhaps the sun reflected on low clouds, or perhaps the destruction of small meteors entering the atmosphere. Several scientists quoted in the newspapers at the time dismissed these suggestions as nonsense. However, when Dr. J. Allen Hynek was consulted by the authorities several months later, the Ohio State University professor of astronomy pointed out some serious problems with Arnold's speed calculations for the objects he had seen. According to Hynek, the objects could not have been 20 to 25 miles away and recognizable as crescent-shaped craft. They would have had to have been virtually the size of mountains, thousands of feet wide instead of 100. If they really were no more than 100 feet wide, then they must have only been a few miles away, and this would drastically reduce the estimate of their speed to well below that of sound. As a result of these considerations, the final report on the Arnold sighting listed it as a mirage. Not surprisingly, Arnold himself vehemently disagreed with any notion that he had misidentified an entirely natural phenomenon, reiterating that he had turned his plane and opened the side window to get a completely unobstructed view of the objects. Hynek's findings, however, would seem ultimately to tip the balance in favor of a mundane explanation for what has come to be known, however erroneously, as the first modern UFO sighting. Near miss with a flying torpedo. Exactly 1 year and 1 month after Kenneth Arnold's sighting, Eastern Airlines Flight 576 was en route from Houston, Texas to Atlanta, Georgia, when Captain Clarence S. Childs and First Officer John B. Whitted spotted an object approaching their DC-3 airplane. At 2:45 a.m., Childs spotted a dull red glow above and ahead of the aircraft. According to his co-pilot, Whitted said, "We sighted an object coming towards us. The strange object had a stream of red fire coming from its tail, and I could see it was much larger than anything I had ever seen or read about. The night was clear, with good visibility, an almost full moon, and only a few scattered clouds about 1,000 feet above the aircraft. Traveling at about 700 miles per hour, the cylindrical wingless object passed the DC-3 on the right side. Owing to the clear conditions, both pilots were able to get a good look at the thing as it passed them. It was about 100 feet long, shaped like a cigar with 2 rows of windows, and upper and lower that were large and square. Those windows were glowing very brightly, and there was an intense blue light underneath the object." Although Childs estimated that the UFO missed their aircraft by about 700 feet, Whitted put the figure at half a mile. The only other witnesses to the encounter was one of the passengers, Clarence McKelvey, who described what he saw as something flashing, a cigar with a cherry flame coming out the back. There was a row of windows, and it was getting in that direction fast. After reaching Atlanta, Charles and Whitted reported their sighting to the Air Force. A subsequent Air Intelligence report stated that the object remained unidentified. According to Report 102-12279, the Air Intelligence Technical Center made a thorough check of 225 flight schedules, both commercial and governmental, which revealed that the only aircraft Childs and Whitted could conceivably have encountered was an Air Force C-47 en route from Robins Air Force Base to Olmsted Field, Pennsylvania. However, the report conceded that the speed, direction of flight, maneuvers, configurations, lights, and other factors ruled out this possibility. The report went on to note that other objects of similar configuration have been reported in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. And in a section entitled Flying Fuselages, Torpedo or Cigar-Shaped Body, the report stated, while the cigar or torpedo-shaped body represents an efficient form for the fuselage of an airplane or the body of a guided missile, in neither case has it been used as a primary lift-producing surface. However, an extension of the Prandtl theory of lift indicates that a fuselage of the dimensions reported by the Eastern Airlines pilot Whitted and Childs in the Montgomery, Alabama incident could support a gross weight of approximately 12,000 pounds at an arbitrarily chosen stalling speed of 150 miles per hour, conservatively estimated. The Prandtl theory probably gives very conservative values of maximum lift for bodies of this shape. If a lift coefficient twice as great were used, such as value have been given by a German scientist from memory of his wind tunnel researches in Germany, a gross weight of 24,000 pounds could be supported at the assumed stalling speed. While no stabilizing fins were apparent on the flying fuselage reported by Whitted and Charles, it is possible that vanes within the jet, operated by gyro server system, could have provided static stability longitudinally, directionally, and laterally. The same varies could have been used for accomplishing static balance or trim, as well as control for maneuvering. A square-tailed body of this type reported with the center of gravity sufficiently far forward can develop approximately a neutral stability, and the possibility exudes that definite static stability could be produced by a judicious use of flow control slots located somewhere along the fuselage. If nothing else, this proves that the Air Force was taking such reports very seriously. According to Project Sign, when investigated UFO reports at the time, more of which later, Childs and Whitted had seen an alien spacecraft. The object, the report concluded, remains unidentified as to origin, construction, and power source. Air Force consultant Dr. Hynek took a different view and suggested that the object might have been a meteor, citing records from amateur astronomers that described a large number, part of the Delta-acquired shower on the evening previous to the Charles Whitted sighting. According to Hynek, the bright flame-like trail and the sudden disappearance implied the presence of a meteor. Dealing with the reported windows on the object, Hynek commented, "It will have to be left to the psychologists to tell us whether the immediately trail of a bright meteor could produce the subjective impression of a ship with lighted windows." Childs and Whitted disagreed with this explanation, maintaining that the object had behaved as if under intelligent control. "That object," said Childs, "flashed down and we veered to the left and it veered to its left. Then it pulled up with a tremendous burst of flame and disappeared into the clouds, as if the pilot had seen us and wanted to avoid us." And then that's it. Let's go ahead and let's finish part 1 here of chapter 1, Close Encounters of the First Kind. So let me go ahead and I'll give my thoughts and opinions on it here. As you can see, this introduction and then followed by this part 1 of chapter 1 shows how this author is talking about things in his book. Very detailed, right? This was why I wanted to showcase it here. Not only is it going to talk about a certain subject, but he's going to feature multiple examples. Plus, it was interesting to see how some of those examples I've talked about already on my channel. Like when it comes to that very, very first sighting associated with the flying saucers, like the one that Kenneth Arnold ran into there in Mount Rainier, and then some of the other sightings that were mentioned as well. Fascinating stuff, right? So here, Close Encounters of the First Kind, as it suggested at the beginning, is more along the lines of encounters with unidentified objects, but for lack of a better term, from afar. Like in other words, nothing nearby, nothing dangerous, nothing that would produce some kind of evidence, like to hold in your hand or touch and so on. No, in this case, it would just be from far away, observational stuff. And here, that's where the chapter was describing it. It was interesting too how they morphed, how the author stated that some of the first items, some of the first sightings had to do more on the lines with mystery flyers, like spacecraft that would just go around, hover, how they had propellers and so on, and then how it morphed into space rockets, how it turned into cigar-shaped items, and then even then that eventually changed into the saucers that we now know, although they rightfully pointed out there was more along the lines of a croissant shape rather than something else involving saucers. But yeah, it goes to show with a theory that I was mentioning on some of my past alien UFOs video, how it almost seems like the technology of UFOs changes with the technology of our time. So something involving like older technology had UFOs looking older as well, for lack of a better term. Like they wouldn't have the space age stuff that we see now, and it would be more along the lines of matching the limited technology that was back then. Makes you wonder, right, why that works, why that still is. I still don't have an answer to that, and it still mystifies me as well. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That'll be part 1, chapter 1, Close Encounters of the First Kind, with here from the book from UFO Sightings by Alan Baker. Let me know what your thoughts are below. Love to hear how this cycle is going when it comes to these videos too. All right, everybody. Thanks again as always. Take care. Bye.